I mean, the reality is that we're using the resources of the future to pay for the present.
Hello, welcome to People, Planet, Profit, a podcast by EarthUP, where we aim to help businesses and people like you simplify sustainability. EarthUP CEO Stephen Bay will be joined by experts, innovators, and lifelong adventurers to break down some of today's biggest topics affecting the triple bottom line of people, planet, and profits. What does a sick building do to your health? Why should corporations be invested in biodiversity? How can I help create better working conditions and happier employees at my company? We'll cover these questions and so much more in a candid conversation about reshaping work culture into a landscape that prioritizes people and planet without sacrificing profit. Our next episode starts right now.
Hey, it's Stephen Bay, CEO of EarthUP. Today we have Laurel Hanscom joining us. Laurel is the CEO of Global Footprint Network, an international nonprofit that envisions a world where we all thrive within the means of our one planet. We're going to talk about our ecological footprint and how we can understand natural resource use. Thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Stephen.
Let's jump right in. I'd love to get to know you a little bit more as an individual and also learn about how you became the CEO of the Global Footprint Network.
If you go way back, I grew up with a couple of biologist parents who raised me in a rural part of San Diego County, and I got to run around in the conservation easement behind our house. They took me on field trips to state parks and out in the desert with their classes. And actually, the very first chore I remember doing was taking scraps out to the compost heap. So I kind of grew up in a way that protecting the environment felt like a given. Out of college, I got a job as an environmental analyst, but I think I've dedicated my life to the sustainability movement because, I was exposed to and made the connection between the environment and social justice. That's the thing that really made it click for me, is recognizing how everything is connected and that the consumption and distribution of resources isn't shared equitably. I spent a couple of years in the Ecuadorian Amazon. I was a Peace Corps volunteer. And then after my time as a volunteer, I worked in the data and strategy office of Peace Corps headquarters in Washington, D.C. So we were collecting data on work being done all over the world by volunteers, and we did things like congressional budget justification reports, things that are very far away from actually being a volunteer on the ground. But I think having those two roles back to back gave me a pretty unique take on data. So I found myself seeing statistics not just as numbers, but sort of having this intuitive connection when looking at a graph or a table to the communities or ecosystems they were describing. And I recognize that's very strange and something that is a hurdle for many people is seeing life in numbers. So when I got the opportunity to join Global Footprint Network after graduate school, I think I brought that sense with me. And I think that has been something that's sort of a driving core element of my work and my life, is bringing those things together.
Any specific stories that come to mind?
One night, I'd been at my site maybe a year or so, where there was a massive storm and the river that I lived next to rose 12 meters overnight. It actually took out a footbridge that crossed this small river. Watched it crack and just take off, like a whole concrete bridge. And the power of that and seeing all of the destruction that caused was overwhelming. It's undeniable to see right in front of you. And that nothing like that had ever happened before in that community. That was completely unprecedented. And the thing is, with climate change and what we're witnessing more and more around the world, is that that's exceedingly and increasingly going to be the norm. It's not, these 100-year floods are no longer 100-year floods. So I think seeing that and just the fear and the terror and also the aftermath of the walking around the community and talking to the shop owners and the community members about, where were you? Are you okay? Have you seen so-and-so? It really drove home for me just how all-encompassing this is and how important it is for us to address.
And you were talking about how it affects certain social classes and certain people more than others.
We can become numb to headlines about floods or other sort of disasters because they're happening so much more frequently. But when you're living through it, and that's not even just abroad, right? That's Katrina, that's, the wildfires in California. And all of it is right on our doorstep. And those are challenges that are inevitably and inextricably exacerbated when there are not the means to adjust to these challenges. A lot of our resilience comes from our ability, in a lot of cases, to come together. But if we don't have, the financial means to get us out of those scary situations or those disastrous situations, if we don't have mutual aid in place, it's invariably going to just get worse. And there are clear winners and losers in that situation.
Let's bring it back to the Global Footprint Network. Tell me about your mission and your origin story.
Absolutely. So Global Footprint Network was actually founded in 2003 by Matas Wackernagel and Susan Burns. And going back a little bit further, Matas actually co-developed the whole ecological footprint concept during his PhD research. But as an organization, our vision is simple. It's a world where everyone thrives within the means of our planet. And we believe to achieve that vision, decisions at all levels need to be made in a way that considers ecological limits. So initially, I would say our role in the sustainability movement overall was to produce data, right? Building on the belief that if people saw these numbers, our fuel gauge, so to speak, right, that they would change course. So we crunched the numbers, we made the science stronger, we put it all out into the world. We worked through partners over the years to show how footprint information can be used to shape decision making. But, as you can imagine, things have changed quite a bit since 2003 in the sustainability conversation. Footprint data was initially pretty novel and shocking, but now it's sort of staple data points for movement leaders. So you have people like Kate Brandt at Google or Steve Howard, who was formerly at IKEA. They've told us, each of them, that they quote our data at the beginning of every presentation they make. We've even had heads of state acknowledge our work, and ministers of environment. What we always come back to is that we have this metric that is both comprehensive with the ecological footprint, and it's also easy to understand. So there's nothing nearly as successful as the ecological footprint in showing in plain language the degree to which we are overusing the planet's renewable resources. And I think importantly, the ecological footprint is based on biology and our interface with nature, which I would argue is vastly underrepresented in the climate change discussion.
You make it tangible for people to understand. You guys have a campaign, the Earth Overshoot Day. I know that this is big in Europe and it's gaining traction in the United States as well.
That's right.
People can go to footprintcalculator.org and get their Global Overshoot Day. I would love for you to explain that a little bit more. I think it was 1.6 Earths is how much we're using right now.
That's right. So Earth Overshoot Day is the day of the year when humanity has consumed all the biological resources that the Earth produces over the entire year. And we've actually been in this state of overshoot since the early 1970s. And the Earth Overshoot Day campaign has been going on just for the last, I think 10 years or so. But in the last few years, we've shifted our focus to move the date. So the Move the Date campaign is something our communications team came up with as a way to focus on all of the many things we can do to push back the date of Earth Overshoot Day. Because, by itself, overshoot is a kind of demoralizing concept. But rather than focusing on that, let's help folks focus on the many opportunities and solutions that already exist that help us move the date.
Is this something that you work with companies, countries on? Who's the primary audience for this?
So more than anything else we do, Earth Overshoot Day is intended for a wider audience because it presents an opportunity to highlight solutions with the Move the Date campaign that are everything from individual actions to policy to cool innovations to, programs. But over the last few years, we've seen increasingly that business leaders and sort of heads of sustainability participate and promote Earth Overshoot Day, either internally in their company or externally for the company to sort of highlight the ways that they are trying to move the date with their actions or activities. We've also seen ministers of environment hold special addresses. We get occasional head of state, which is very cool. And then, of course, civil leaders like Pope Francis and Greta Thunberg have referred to our work. So millions of followers get to hear that as well. It's really the broadest audience that we talk to. But I do see there being a particular opportunity for businesses to use this as a moment to highlight the things that they're doing. What are you doing? can we coalesce across businesses to show the opportunities that are out there in a way that is less about the scary and more about the opportunity?
Seems like a great way for companies and CEOs too to really engage employees and unify a community around let's move the date. How has it been doing? Have we been able to move the date? How was 2020 versus 2019 versus 2018? How are we doing on let's move the date?
Let's see. If we go back a few years, I think 2017 Earth Overshoot Day was on August 1st. And then the last couple of years after that, so 18 and 19, I think we're looking at July 29th. So moving kind of in the wrong direction, not great. And then in 2020, it jumped all the way to August 22nd, which on a normal year would have been something huge to celebrate. But it was 2020. And the reason for that jump was not because we'd started implementing all of these amazing solutions, but because we were struck by tragedy. And so for us, that wasn't a celebration. We talk about moving to the date, but that is not the way that we want it to happen. We often say that sustainability in the end will happen by design or by disaster. One way or another, we're going to come back into some kind of a balance. And the goal is that happens by design. And I think the pandemic and all of the subsequent lockdowns, like that is an example of disaster. That's an example of things coming back into being realigned, but not in the ways that we were actively participating in.
Yeah, it wasn't the structural change that led to the pushback of the overshoot day, right?
No, unfortunately not.
Have you guys mapped out, if we do implement certain things, how that day can accelerate? Because I'm sure it's going to be kind of slow. And then once we hit a certain point, there's going to be an acceleration point.
The number of variables involved and how that could happen are almost infinite. And so it's really challenging to try to guess when and how that could happen. That said, we have worked with the team at Drawdown Labs to calculate how many days would be moved by their top 80 solutions or the top 100 solutions. We have worked with companies like Schneider Electric to calculate how many days we would move if everyone adopted some of their efficiency technology. I think it was something like 15 or 25 days or something like that. So there are, opportunities to kind of to calculate that and see in days how much we can move the date.
Have you guys looked at some of the new administration's plans with electrification of the fleets in regards to all the things that we're trying to implement on the national level now? Have you done that type of analysis yet?
We haven't done the math yet. I think that would be a very exciting thing to actually calculate out. By the time this comes out, we may have, but we haven't just yet, since that was just last week or this past week. The US being such a major player in terms of our contribution to ecological overshoot at a global level, it is super important that we're taking these steps, and any way that can be accelerated is paramount.
So what type of data points go into somebody's ecological footprint?
A lot of time when we say footprint, there's an assumption that we're talking about just the carbon footprint, which has been sort of the primary unit that everyone has been focused on, and rightfully so, because carbon footprint is roughly 60% of our total ecological footprint. But when we're measuring ecological footprint, we are also considering the food we eat. We are considering the fish we harvest, the trees that we cut down, either for building or for creating pulp. Everything that we consume is captured in ecological footprint. And we are able to do that because we're able to do a little bit of math. We take all of this data and we're able to put everything into a common unit. So footprint accounting is based on two really simple principles. If you are to be sustainable, harvest cannot exceed regeneration. And two, waste production cannot exceed waste assimilation.
So how would you measure that?
To measure this, we start with the premise that all of our consumption can be mapped onto area. Everything we eat, everything we wear, everything we build. We figure out how much area was required to provide the resources that went into that meal or that t-shirt or that desk. And importantly, how much forest was required to sequester the CO2 that we emitted into the atmosphere. And then the other big principle is that we look at natural resources in terms of competing for space. So you can't grow corn on a freeway. You can't sequester carbon in a forest that's been cut down for grazing land. We know that not all bioproductive area is equal. So we do a little bit more math to account for the different levels of productivity between land types. So sort of similar to the way we talk about CO2 equivalents. We use a unit of world average productivity that we call global hectares, which allows us to compare different kinds of pressures on the planet, apples to apples, so to speak.
What are some of the most alarming things as far as our consumption?
On a global scale, I feel like focusing on a single resource is a bit of a distraction from the bigger issue. What's abundant in one area might be scarce in another, but globally, biological productivity is the most limiting factor to our continued ability to exist. So it's not one resource per se, but the sum total of our demand. Too many fish, too many chickens, too much paper, too much carbon emissions. And that's why we see all of these environmental crises happening at the same time. The synchronicity is not really a coincidence. And we know for sure that the bioproductivity of the planet is being severely compromised by biodiversity loss. So the underlying currency of nature is biological regeneration, and we haven't found an alternative to that yet. And globally, I'd say that's our biggest issue.
What are some of the most productive types of lands that we're losing at an alarming rate?
The one for carbon certainly is the sequestration capacity of our forests. And I think the easiest example for people to see and understand is the rainforests being cut down for grazing purposes. You are losing land that was formerly sequestering carbon or providing something that we absolutely all need and replacing it with something that is limiting our ability on a number of levels. So I would say, I think that's something that it's a pretty clear example of those trade-offs.
So one of the biggest culprits is companies that are chopping down land for harvesting. Is that kind of, if to sum it up?
And there's so many different pressures that we put on the planet. I would say that culprits abound. Like most systemic problems, it's a little more complicated than being able to point to one player or another. I mean, the reality is that we're using the resources of the future to pay for the present. And my colleague Matis likes to call this an ecological Ponzi scheme. Essentially, in asking that, you're saying, who's the ecological Madoff, right? Is it the people who refuse to see the Ponzi scheme? Is it those who don't want to keep the accounts honest? Is it lack of government will to really hold companies accountable for their efforts? And one of the things we know is that 16% of the world's population lives in high-income countries that consume almost 60% of the world's biocapacity. So there's a lot of blame that we can place on big consumers and emitters, and the answers aren't simple. But at the end of the day, the ultimate goal is that we all thrive within the means of our planet. And to do so, we need to secure the ultimate means for that to happen, which is keeping the natural resources that we do have, that they are being replenished at a rate that is greater than we are consuming them.
So what do we do about it? I mean, you said it kind of right there. Don't use more than we have, and don't, deplete future productivity to service now. But what are some of the things that we can do? Is eating local one of them? Is it companies really understanding the impacts? Is it investing? From your perspective, what are some of the things that both companies and individuals can do right now?
So one of the things that I find most encouraging in a line of work that can sometimes feel kind of demoralizing is that there are so many solutions that already exist that can be implemented right now. Drawdown is a great collection of what those things can be. We also work with Schneider Electric. They're a partner of ours, and they like to say more Schneider, better planet. And the idea there is that there are so many retrofit solutions. There's so much that we can do right now that we don't have to come up with new fancy technology to implement. It's just a matter of the will to scale those solutions and get them out there into the world. Understanding that the rapid energy transition, the rapid transition to a lower consumption economy is essential for our, the longevity of our species. and the species that we share this planet with. And we have the tools already. It's just a matter of us deploying them and undoing this unstable system that we've built for ourselves.
So it sounds like the solution is driving adoption. So we have existing tools. How do we drive that adoption across individuals, employees, employers, cities, states, and countries?
Now, I would imagine that there is a different answer for each of those different groups. From an individual perspective, we have learned through our research that the largest factor in making changes in one's own life is actually who they live with. If you live in a household or you work with people or you share space with other people who are making decisions that are more sustainable, then you are more likely to do so. There's a critical mass issue where we're at the beginning of this turning point. Once we hit, there's a tipping point where it will just be inevitable. And we will all see sustainability as being just completely necessary and essential to our survival rather than what it has been, which is an externality, a nice to have, a noble deed, something like that. So I think in some ways it's not like a particular action, but it's a mindset. It's a frame of how we approach every question and every decision in our day to say, is this aligned with moving us out of ecological overshoot? Is this aligned with us being able to thrive within the means of our one planet? And that looks very different for different actors.
It makes a lot of sense that the community, the people you surround yourself, really help guide what you do and how you interact. It sounds like awareness is the first key to driving that adoption, connecting people with existing solutions. And, at EarthUP, we call it the aha moment. And what's great that we figured out is that a lot of this awareness actually improves people's lives. So it's not like they have to make sacrifices to be sustainable, which historically be vegan, all these things around how you have to sacrifice the climate diet, but actually you improve, you enrich, you make yourself more comfortable, healthier to lead a sustainable life. So what are some of the key ways that you guys are doing that at Global Footprint Network? Create that aha moment, as we call it at EarthUp.
One amazing tool that I think has created an aha moment for, it's going to sound like a big number, but I don't think it's an exaggeration. I think millions of people have taken our footprint calculator and walked away with that feeling of, oh, wow, I had no idea. This is something anyone can do. Go to footprintcalculator.org and find out what your footprint is. Find out what Earth Overshoot Day would be if everyone lived like you. The tricky thing is that depending on where you are in your sustainability journey, that could either be demoralizing, it could be energizing. Hopefully it's energizing, but it can also be kind of embarrassing or scary. And so we try to meet people where they are and say, look, this is something that's shocking, perhaps, but it is also a clear-eyed look at where you are. And break it down by the different types of footprint. You can kind of see where you can find some gains in your own life. And I think that those are important aspects of what we offer with the footprint calculator. There are ample opportunities in our lives to tap into that. And I think EarthUp has some pretty interesting ways to address that as well. Businesses
now are understanding that every single stakeholder cares about this, whether it's investors, whether it's their executive team, whether it's consumers, whether it's employees. This is a priority for everybody. So I would love to hear the companies that haven't had those aha moments. What are some business implications that are going to come down the road if we don't really seriously address this issue?
Risk to business is inherently risky to employees and stakeholders because planning for this inevitable future that we can see coming, not taking steps right away to address that has a very clear trickle down to these key stakeholders. If a company was in a situation where they're like, okay, I recognize this is something we need to do. Where do I start? To me, I think the really important thing from a sustainability perspective is that it needs to move away from just the CSR conversation into overall business strategy. If a company right now wants to be around in 10 years, We need to be saying to ourselves, what parts of our business model rely on fossil fuels and how can we move away from them as quickly as possible? Every decision, but especially those related to longer term investments like infrastructure, needs to consider that. The bigger the investment, the longer term the consequences of the investment, the more important it is to do that right away. Because the longer we wait to shift that mentality, the harder it is to reverse. And actually, the more expensive it will be when you get to the point when that needs to change. Making decisions now to build infrastructure that is not one planet compatible means stranded assets and, challenges that will inevitably need to be rectified, but will be harder and more expensive the longer we wait to implement them.
60% of the entire ecological footprint is based on carbon emissions in the world.
Correct.
So that's why you see companies making these net zero commitments. As companies are really looking at the different stakeholders that are involved, historically, companies have been tracking emissions when people come into the office space, and some in scope 3 track employee commute, but not a lot of companies now are tracking employees' work from home emissions. Can you dive into a little bit more about why it would be important for companies to start trying to understand the footprint of their employees outside of the workspace?
Looking at the footprint of a company, as you say, there's traditionally, I would say, when employees are going into the office, that sits in scope 1 or scope 2, depending on how you classify that. Widespread telework has essentially pushed that all into scope 3. I've even heard this referred to as scope 4. From an accounting perspective, this obviously makes things a lot more complicated, but no less important to consider. In some cases, it's probably more efficient for someone to work from home. In other cases, it might not be. Maybe there are efficiencies gained by going into the office. But I think what's most important from a business perspective and a considering our sustainability perspective is that those are captured in a way that supports employees. My fear in talking about what should employers do with their employees is that we're not putting more burden on someone who's working from home or transferring the burden or the sort of accountability to them in the process of attempting to capture the sustainability factors or the emissions factors of a different setup.
And you just announced the overshoot date for 2021 is July 29th?
That's right.
Well, thank you, Laurel. We're in the quick hitter section of the podcast now. Are you ready for it?
Okay, let's do it.
What gets you up in the morning?
Usually it's my toddler waddling in with his pillow.
That is my wake-up call as well. What's your breakfast beverage when your little toddler wakes you up?
Coffee, splash of milk.
Coffee, splash of milk. Is there any books that you would recommend about our resources?
So Moses Fakernagel has a great book on ecological footprint that I would recommend folks pick up. I've already mentioned Drawdown, but I would say there's actually a Paul Hawken book that's a bit older, Blessed Unrest, that was really influential in my thinking.
What's one thing you recommend people do in their daily routine that can either get them to that aha moment or that can actually reduce their environmental impact?
It's going to sound silly, but get more sleep. You make bad decisions and take shortcuts when you're tired. So if you can get some more sleep, you're going to make better decisions. So sleeping is incredibly eco-friendly.
I like that one. Any new products or technologies that are coming out that you think can really help accomplish our goals and push back overshoot day?
Maybe this is going to be a plug for the footprint calculator. I really think that if more people had the opportunity to understand their individual impact and associated that with sort of our bigger story, I think that would make the world a better place.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have you. We're excited to continue to work with Global Footprint Network as we move forward. And we're excited to highlight the Overshoot Day on our product. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. And I look forward to our continued conversations.
And that's our episode. If you'd like more info about what Laurel is doing at Global Footprint Network and for ways to move the date of Earth Overshoot Day, visit footprintnetwork.org. EarthUP's new platform that simplifies sustainability for companies and communities is now live. To jump into the platform and start making change at home and work, go to app.earthup.eco. Become an early adopter and help us create an easier, more effective, and more fun platform for our community. Thank you so much for listening in and for your support. If you like our show, hit that subscribe button, tell a friend, and rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Your support helps us reach a wider audience, so thank you. To learn more about EarthUp and our journey to simplifying sustainability, visit earthup.eco and follow EarthUp on LinkedIn.